Hello and welcome to the Glossy Week in Review podcast. I'm your host, senior fashion reporter Danny Parisi, and I'm here with our international reporter, Zofia Zwieglinska. Hello, Zofia. How's it going?
Yeah, dreary week.
It really is. This week, the biggest news story, and feels like the only news story, is, of course, the election. We got to talk about it. You know, the results will have a huge impact on the industries that Glossy covers and probably a lot of our listeners. So we will be talking about the election and what that means for the future. We will also take a little time to talk about the rumored acquisition attempt of Burberry by Moncler, which, Zofia, you tipped me off to. And then we will finish by talking about the looming EU probe into Temu and how Temu is responding to it and the kind of attendant issues around that. Let's start with the election. Let's just jump right into it. Donald Trump won. He won decisively. And now we have to prepare for what the next 4 years are going to be like. At Glossy on Wednesday, we all kind of pivoted pretty quickly to write about some of the ways his reelection will impact our industries. So after this podcast, if you haven't, I highly recommend going to the Glossy website or signing up for our newsletter, because we had a lot of good stories this week, looking at different responses, not just the presidential election, but I wrote about Proposition 36, which passed in California, which increases the punishment for shoplifting, which I know a lot of retailers are concerned about. So we covered a lot of election-related stuff over this week. I was thinking with Trump coming back, I think something helpful would be to look back at the first term, 2016 to 2020, and look for some guidance there. I think it's obviously not going to be exactly the same. Second term presidents tend to behave a little differently since they don't have to worry about re-election. His administration is probably going to have a lot of different people since he fired or fell out with a lot of people from the first term. One thing that I think will stay the same is that the first term was marked by just unpredictability. Trump changes his mind frequently. He hires and fires people quickly. Policies that get talked about a lot just fall by the wayside, and things that have never been mentioned before come out of nowhere. So I think that at the very least, the next 4 years will be almost like the pandemic, where brands are just and the industry is just waiting to see what happens and trying to react on shorter notice to whimsical policy changes. I have a bunch more thoughts, but I don't want to dominate. I mean, Zofia, what's the mood in the UK about this result?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the Conservatives winning. It's never a good reaction, I think, especially in London, just because with Trump winning, it does end up almost reverberating on what happens in the political scene in the UK and beyond. And obviously, you know, with so many Conservatives and also, you know, other parties, I think there's some Britain First parties which are kind of similar in rhetoric. They'll obviously see this as, you know, a big kind of sign of support for the sentiment, which is, you know, something that I think might be a little bit more general compared to, you know, the kind of partisan conversation happening in the US. So I think, yeah, that's something that is going to be impacting things. And obviously, you know, considering the kind of stance that he's taken on, you know, tariffs and things, I'm wondering, you know, what that's going to mean for international trade.
Yeah, absolutely. There's, I think, a lot of concrete things we can talk about that will be relevant to our listeners. I think a big one for me is Trump is obviously extremely business friendly. He's pro big business. I think large corporations are going to benefit greatly from his presidency. In his first term, he rolled back a lot of labor rights, like overtime protection for workers. A Trump-controlled National Labor Review Board, I think, will certainly be filled with anti-union, anti-labor officials, which is going to be a little bit of a change because during the Biden administration, one thing that came out of that was a little bit of a shift toward a more pro-labor, pro-union, pro-worker mindset from the NLRB. And also a separate organization, but the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. Lena Khan, who was a Biden appointee, was a vocal opponent of a lot of corporate mega mergers and anti-competitive practices. Definitely she's out. No way Trump, who is deep ties to mega corporations and billionaire donors, no way is he going to keep her around. So I expect whoever he replaces her with to be much friendlier to giant companies merging and other kind of things like that. The NLRB, I think, will definitely be weakened and defanged, which I think will have impact on various unionization efforts in the fashion industry. And we've talked a little bit about union efforts in the garment industry or in the ports, actually, the port strike, which was narrowly averted a month or two ago. this will impact that. So that's one thing I'm expecting is like an administration that's much less friendly to the interests of workers and much more aligned with kind of larger corporations. So that's definitely going to be a major change. And then you alluded to tariffs. I think that's another big one. I mean, Trump has talked openly about implementing like a blanket 10% or 20% tariff on all imports into the country, and maybe a higher tariff rate on goods from China. I feel like this is probably the most immediately impactful thing that people are thinking about. The stated reason is to encourage businesses to bring more business back to the US. But from what I've read, I think the consensus economic opinion is that people will just still import stuff. They'll just raise the prices. So we already have dealt with like price increases in the US, I think probably abroad as well. So in the US, though, I think a blanket 10% tariff on all imported goods is absolutely going to have an immediate impact on the economy, on the average consumer's life, and on many of the brands that we kind of write and talk about. I'll stop there because I could keep going. But let's talk a little bit more about tariffs. Like, I mean, what's your take on what that would do to the broader industry?
Yeah, I mean, obviously kind of looking at the situation in the UK where, like prices have risen quite significantly for consumer products. I think that what I've read for US products, if these tariffs would be coming into effect, I think the maximum rise, reportedly anyway, is supposed to be 5% across the board, which I feel is a pretty big kind of amount, considering when you're thinking about it, you're not just looking at, one category of products. This will be a very broad range of consumer products that you're looking at, and especially if there are companies, like Temu or Shein who are importing these directly from China. I think there's a definite kind of growth there in those prices, especially considering how cheap they are. So yeah, I'm interested to see how this kind of goes, especially since a lot of the companies, in the efforts to combat the kind of various shipping delays, have moved production to Mexico, for example. And that's also been one of the other targets of these kind of reported tariff conversations that Trump has mentioned. So I'm wondering, does that mean that they'll end up being kind of taxed twice? Let's say if they're being produced in China and then finished off in Mexico, does that mean, a kind of double tariff there? And then obviously, what happens to all of these companies who've probably invested a lot of money into relocating maybe their existing production to Mexico or to South America? How is that going to be affecting their bottom line?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the companies we talk to, I feel like, are very concerned about their margins. Profit margins can be pretty slim on some of the categories that we cover. And so if you add in an extra 10% tariff into the production of a product, the production and distribution of a product that maybe already has a pretty narrow margin, like there's no way to avoid that other than just to raise the prices. Like, and not just for fashion, I think this kind of applies to any imported goods. Like if Honda is importing a car and the 10% tariff is like another $6,000 or $8,000 or something, there's no way they're just going to eat that.
Yeah.
And so even though that goes beyond like fashion and beauty, which are the industries we cover, it does affect the consumer's kind of like whole wallet. If everything is more expensive, that's going to affect kind of these industries as well.
Yeah.
Last thing I think we should talk about is abortion. This was a hugely impactful part of the first Trump term, was the appointment of lots of judges at the Supreme Court and also at other levels of the judiciary that ended up with Roe v. Wade being overturned, which is like, was unthinkable, I think, for a lot of people, but it happened. Because of the U.S.'s sort of unique federal structure, like there's still places where abortion and reproductive health care and rights are protected. In New York, where I am, they just passed Proposition 1, which enshrines some of these things into the state law in a deeper way. But there are a lot of places in the country that are now much more dangerous to be pregnant or to be capable of getting pregnant. And we talked a little bit about this when Roe v. Wade was first overturned, but I absolutely think that's going to have an effect on the demographics of the country, people, if they can, leaving places like that. And also fashion and beauty both are like industries that are heavily represented by women who are mostly impacted by changes like that. So I don't know exactly all the many ways that gigantic, impactful decision is going to affect things in the future, but a continued very conservative government, which, by the way, the Republicans have basically now control all three branches of government, definitely paves the way, I think, for further restrictions, potentially even an attempt at a national abortion ban, although I don't know if that could actually happen, but you never know. We also thought Roe v. Wade could not be overturned, and then it did. So anyway, I feel like that will have many, many large and rippling effects on just kind of like the entire fabric of the US, which obviously affects, again, our industry's fashion and beauty, but also just like affects life for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that whole kind of family values thing that, Trump has been talking about, I think that this just doesn't extend that far. And honestly, like, I think when I was doing some research for this VC story that came out, on the kind of VC reaction to Trump's kind of win, I think that a lot of what came out is that, so much of the kind of spending money and, kind of, I guess, the country's GDP goes through women. So I'm wondering, in terms of those spending choices, if all of this is going to be shifted, if maybe some of those red states won't be moving forward quite as quickly in terms of that growth of spending, which, is typically what I guess makes sure that a country doesn't go into a recession, which is something that we've been dancing around for a good couple of months now. With these price increase, with these, I guess, changes, is this something that could potentially impact that consumer spending category? There's been a lot of talk in the last day or two about how like markets are rallying and like a lot of big companies are pretty happy at the fact that Trump's been elected. Is this something that maybe will change later on in time and will affect that kind of consumer spending category in a really big way?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that a recession is not unlikely. And a lot of the kind of pro-business changes that Trump champions are like good for the corporations in the short term, but then also kind of just lead to a more unstable economic and political environment for everyone. So we'll see how that goes. Maybe we move on to our next topic before I get too depressed. But Burberry and Moncler. So you tipped me off to this one. I had not seen it, but there were rumors this week that Moncler, which also has investment from LVMH, is trying to make a bid to buy Burberry. The rumor is unconfirmed by either company, but reported on by Ms. Tweed, which seemed to me pretty credible. I think we should first start by talking about Burberry's kind of current state, because I feel like it's kind of been struggling. There have been multiple profit warnings. Its share price dropped like 40% this year or something. CEO Jonathan Ackroyd just left. It really feels like it's in a little bit of a tough spot, which I think also makes it a good acquisition target. I don't know. What do you think about why Burberry is in this position and whether they'll actually get picked up by somebody else?
Yeah, I think that, it's a lot of we've been doing something the same way for however many years, and we should continue doing it that same way, even though like it's completely messing with the company and its revenues. Like, I think Burberry's been stuck in the same place for a really long time. And only kind of very, very recently have I thought, okay, you know what, actually this shift might be a good thing. I don't know if you saw, but there was this ad that came out, an ad campaign kind of focusing on like this really like boring aesthetic, if I have to say it, and around
boring aesthetic.
Literally, it's just like Cara Delevingne sitting there like talking about rain or something. Like it's very, if I had to say it, it's very British, and I actually quite liked it. I think that this is the very, very first step of maybe a number of moves that are going to be happening at Burberry to kind of try and turn it around. There's a bit more focus on the trench, which is obviously like the signature item for the company. And I think that there's a little bit more of like almost like a turn back. We've been talking in other industries. Starbucks made a lot of kind of consulting level changes with the company, which were really unpopular. And I kind of feel like Burberry's the same, where it's implemented a lot of different changes varying by creative director, and now it's kind of coming back to what it's kind of known for. I think that brand identity, something that hasn't really been quite as important as it should have been the last couple of years. And Moncler, I would say, in terms of brand identity, is something that they've really been killing it over the last couple of years. Like, there's been so many of the Genius campaigns they've been doing around the world that have really well kind of resonated. They've embraced the creative industries. They've kind of done a lot of entertainment focused things. But in general, I'd say that they've got that kind of mix of luxury, entertainment, aesthetics, and creative, like really, really well. So I'm wondering if this is something that they would be able to do to take over Burberry. But at the same time, Burberry's a, very kind of British company. I'm not sure if they'll be super comfortable with getting taken over by a company like Moncler.
Yeah. And I was thinking also, we've talked a ton about this on the podcast, but a lot of luxury brands are struggling right now. There's like a kind of slowdown and downturn across the luxury sector, but it does feel like Burberry's issues go beyond that. Like it's not just the macro environment a little bit. One more thing about it that I think is interesting is the LVMH component. Another thing we've talked about a lot is LVMH having kind of an octopus-like control of like fashion and luxury, just like tentacles everywhere. And LVMH has a 15% stake in Double R, which is the company that owns Moncler. So if Moncler bought Burberry, LVMH would be like its grandfather, kind of. There would be like a subtle LVMH exertion of control over Burberry, but through the lens of like this other company, or two other companies actually. And I feel like that's actually has been LVMH's kind of playbook the last couple of years. They own a lot of brands and they have bought brands, but recently it seems like they're expanding and acquiring stuff, but not directly. It's through investment vehicles, through their venture arm, through investing in a company that then owns another company, that kind of thing. Like it's interesting that LVMH doesn't want to just buy Burberry directly, but would rather kind of like have this subtle, indirect kind of relationship with it. So I don't know. I feel like it has been a while since LVMH has just straight up bought like another designer.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. I think that they're probably a little bit concerned about diluting that brand identity. I think, because of the fact that they've got so much control of that luxury industry, I think there's probably concerns around, making it too homogenous. Like if every brand is like, Louis Vuitton, then, there's no brands essentially. Like it's all just one big kind of LVMH kind of factory. So I think that with this, maybe they're trying to keep those brands themselves like as unique as they can possibly be, so they have that differentiation. And also, I'm not sure how much of a legal kind of aspect, but I'm assuming there's some antitrust things that go into controlling too much of the market.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right that also like LVMH has their core portfolio of brands that are like LVMH brands are pretty focused and high quality. So I can see them not wanting to potentially dilute that, like you said. Especially acquisitions are interesting because I feel like if a company's not doing well, it's a good time to buy it because it'll be cheaper. But then at the same time, now you've like bought a company that's not doing well. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas you could buy a company that's doing great, but it'll probably be expensive because it's doing great. So you have to be confident that you can affect positive change if you're going to buy a company that's like on the downhill. And I think that that's possible. Like Moncler, it's possible to do that, especially with the LVMH backing. I wonder if that will necessitate some more intense like creative and leadership changes at Burberry if they do acquire it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would assume that there would be, although there's been so many changes recently at Burberry that I'm wondering if that's going to be, helpful. Obviously, each of these transitions takes time to put into effect. We've talked about at length how long these kind of creative directors have at each brand to actually implement change. You can't expect, a complete turnaround after one season. Like I'm wondering if, this is something that might be considering, but at the same time it might take a much longer time to actually implement because of the fact that these changes are very delicate.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Let's talk about our final topic, which is Temu. Right now, they are being probed by the European Union Commission over whether they violated the Digital Services Act. There was a request for information, I think they call it RFI, from the EU to Temu a couple of weeks ago to see if they were kind of just like look at how they were operating their business. And then the results of that request for information led to a full probe. And specifically, there's a couple of things that the EU is looking at, which is the sale of counterfeit goods, data collection, and then an interesting one to me was the addictive nature of Temu, like of the platform, which is, I think of charges like that more directed at stuff like TikTok, like social media content kind of stuff, or gambling, like sports betting apps, things like that. Not sure if I've ever seen like the potential allegation of like addictive patterns in a shopping app. Certainly, I'm sure there are like designers of these apps who have looked at the tactics that apps like TikTok or whatever use to keep people hooked, but I don't think I've ever really seen that raised to a retailer or a marketplace like this. But I thought that was interesting. I think you've done a little bit of reporting on this whole world of like Shein and Temu and the regulation around them and stuff like that. What's your take on this probe? Like, do you think it's got legs? Do you think Temu will respond in some way? Like, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it's quite interesting because I think that Shein has been the target of, EU kind of investigations over the last couple of years. Temu's kind of stayed out of it on the most part. I don't think there's been any kind of bigger investigations into its operation simply because it has been operating mainly in the US. I think its presence in the EU has been smaller, but obviously as they have expanded into Europe, I think that has also come with, a load of potential, I guess, issues or concerns from the EU because they're worried about their citizens, and very rightly so. I've reported on, these kind of dark patterns and gamification elements with these apps for quite a long time now. I think that you're exactly right. When you're talking about TikTok and the kind of gamified content that you're seeing, all of the ways that you're potentially, I don't know, sending money to creators by tapping a button, or, if you're on TikTok Shop and you're getting discounts through like a discount wheel, for example. Those are things that both Temu and Shein have implemented in their apps, as well as, daily rewards. So if you go in multiple times per week, you get bigger rewards. Or, for example, you would get a bigger discount if you have a bigger order. All of these kind of really small elements kind of play around with how much money can you save. And I think that that's where that kind of addictive nature of that service kind of comes in, because you're talking about not just giving people discounts, but actually almost making it a system over time where you have to engage with it repeatedly to actually get those discounts. So it's quite a delicate thing, because I think that a lot of companies are looking towards these models almost as like a guide on how to build up that I guess, like engagement. So yeah, I think it's an interesting way to think about the way that apps are evolving for retailers, and think about, how these models are maybe not quite as good. Good for the retailer potentially if you're getting a lot more sales, but very bad for the consumer if they're getting more and more addicted to, essentially shopping apps. Obviously, on the other two fronts, the counterfeit goods, that's been an issue that's been coming up repeatedly. I think there's been a number of designers and small business owners who have complained about Temu and Shein ripping off their designs and posting them with different materials and lower quality techniques, and then, selling them without giving the kind of rights back to those kind of small businesses. So I think that that's something that's a real issue. And then obviously, because of where these companies are located and how they're kind of processing data and information, I think that especially with tied to that kind of interaction and engagement data, you're looking at a huge amount of data that's sitting by, a shopping retailer that's not quite as maybe regulated as Amazon. So I'm wondering, is that something that's going to be an issue there?
Okay, that was very thorough. And I actually came into this. No, that was good. I came into this thinking that I wanted to talk more about the counterfeit stuff, but I actually think the addictive nature of retail apps, I think, is super interesting. And you use the term dark patterns. And like, if anyone has not heard that term, I highly recommend looking it up, because you will, once you read about it, you will notice them in like basically every piece of consumer software that we are exposed to. I noticed the other day, I have the Reddit app on my phone, and I was like looking at something, I upvoted a comment, and a little thing came up that was like, it was like 1 out of 30, like one, like my streak of like interacting with the app, and it was like, like if you upvote something tomorrow, then it'll be 2 out of 30. And then it's like, for some like it touched some button in my head, but I was like, well, now I have to do it 30 times. Like I like, just for a second, I felt that. I didn't even say what you get or like what happens when you get to 30, but it just triggered some animal part of my brain where I was like, I have to do it 30 times now to like, fill this little bar. And then I was like, that is so stupid. Like, why do I care about interacting with this app? And it kind of feels like any app, any program, any website that you go to now has these kinds of things baked into it. And like you said, it's understandable why they do, because it's good for whoever, it's good for the retailer, it's good for the publisher, whoever is making it. Having people addicted to your product is good for business. It's bad for the people. Addiction is not good, but it is good for business. And it's sort of like, if every other company is doing it, it's like, why wouldn't you? It's like a competitive disadvantage for us not to like embrace these kind of patterns. And a lot of it does come, like, there's a reason it's called gamification, because a lot of it does come from like mobile games, which are the most like the free mobile games, but where it's like you have to spend $5 to get more gems or whatever. It's like the blueprint for this whole like world now. So that's really interesting and like very dystopian to me. On the counterfeit thing, though, I think that's kind of an interesting, kind of inherent element of an open marketplace. Like Amazon has dealt with the counterfeit issues for years now. Temu does the same thing. Like any platform where you're selling stuff, but you, the owner of the platform, are not in control of the product, I feel like that's inevitably going to happen. And you just like have less visibility on the product as opposed to like a wholesale online retailer like Net-a-Porter, by the way, which like they buy product the same way that like a retailer does. They buy product and sell it, whereas Amazon and Temu allow other people to sell on the platform. And it's like, it's I think something you can do a lot about, but it does feel like an inherent just danger of that style of business model. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that for a lot of companies that have, sent out, kind of cease and desist letters or lawsuits, it's essentially almost like a whack-a-mole game where even though you might get one down, another listing pops up, which is almost exactly the same. And then you just have to do that over and over again. So it can become, a kind of very most likely expensive, because you're talking about kind of legal process, but also just very time-consuming practice where it's most likely going to make a lot more sense to just not run that product, or else, differentiate it so that it is a better quality than what is going to be sold on Temu. But yeah, I think there's a number of issues here. And obviously with EU regulators, depending obviously on the outcome of the kind of EU election, kind of like all of those things that are happening there, I think that these things are still very important to kind of EU customers, but also like regulators. And I think that that's something that they're going to be very closely kind of like keeping an eye on, just to make sure that that's a strict kind of environment for these companies, because most of them operate globally. And if they keep to EU standards, it means that those standards are going to have to be applied worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Okay, I think that's all the time we have. But Zofia, this was a great conversation. Thank you for being here. Thank you for bringing your international perspective to my dumb American brain.
Oh my God, no. I mean, I never quite feel quite right talking about American politics, but it affects everyone, not just Americans. So happy to weigh in. Thank you so much.
Of course, you probably know more about American politics than the average American knows about UK politics.
Oh
but
my God.
But thank you for being here. For those of you listening, don't forget to give us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or wherever you listen to the Glossy podcast, because that helps us out so much. And don't forget to subscribe to the Glossy podcast, because you'll hear interviews with industry insiders every Wednesday and weekend review episodes with me every Friday. Until then, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.